His topic today is Justice and Mercy. Please welcome Judge Kevin Smith.
Before I dive into the presentation, I want you guys to think of a couple of things, because that's really, if you could summarize what I'm going to discuss today, you really could summarize it by stating these two incidents. A few weeks ago, a judge in Southern California sentenced a young lady to probation, 2 years probation. The facts of the case were, her and her boyfriend had been smoking marijuana, and she had a mental incident that arose from that smoking of marijuana, and she stabbed him over 100 times. He didn't survive, obviously. He died. She murdered him. And that judge, even though the most they could do because of the alleged mental issue with the marijuana was send her to prison for 5 years, and that's what the prosecutor asked for, and the judge put her on probation for 2 years. Now, more recently, and again, that's West Coast. Now let's go to the East Coast. More recently, anybody see the video of the 2 police officers that were beat up by a bunch of illegal immigrants? Anybody see that? D.A. Bragg initially released 6 of 7 of those defendants. 6 of them got on a bus and went to the West Coast somewhere. Nobody knows where they are. Only one of them was held in custody. And did you see the video of these young men when they were cut loose, showing the bird, the middle finger, showing the great respect for our justice system? And then, of course, Bragg came out and said that when he watched the video, he was sickened to his stomach, not sickened enough to hold them in custody while they decided to charge them. And they charged 7 of them, but of course 6 are nowhere to be found. And I want you to think about those cases, because again, in one case it was a West Coast state, and the other case it was an East Coast state, New York City. So now, with that set up, I do want to thank you for the opportunity to speak to you this evening. Usually when I discuss in front of groups and present in front of groups like this, it is about the foster care crisis. And I want to be clear, we still need a lot of new foster families, as well as support for children that are in foster care. But the past 3 years, capped with the incidents we've seen just recently, have revealed a much bigger crisis, a total lack of understanding about justice and mercy in society and the legal system. In the words of President Joe Biden, it's an existential crisis. Now, of course, President Biden was referring to climate change, but I thought it fit. Ephesians 5:11 states that we are to take no part in the unfruitful works of darkness, but instead expose them. If you spend a few minutes reading the New York Times or the Washington Post, you might conclude that justice is mostly about leveling the playing field from one group to the next. If one group is overrepresented in the system, then the prison gates must be opened and the excess purged. Or perhaps the less represented group prosecuted more aggressively. In fact, both Presidents Donald Trump and President Joe Biden pardoned thousands of drug felons from the federal prison system for this very reason, despite the fact that most, if not all, of these federal inmates began with drug trafficking charges and pled down to felony possession. In other words, these individuals were feeding us poison in our communities. But this is social justice, not actual justice, and certainly not mercy. It ignores other realities of the crime statistics. For example, if 13, and these are facts, these are actual numbers from the system, if 13% of the population commits 60% of the crimes, then this group will be overrepresented. Also, social justice-minded prosecutors refuse to prosecute drug offenses because there's a higher representation of minorities committing such offenses, and they are allegedly victimless crimes. However, this ignores the link between drugs and violent gang-related crimes and the need to deter such activities so bystanders aren't murdered. By the way, the majority of murdered bystanders are, in fact, minorities. Thus, if our goal is to punish criminals and protect the public, Social justice cannot be the objective. Otherwise, the system is indeed racist, and racism is neither just nor merciful. Moreover, we, the people of all races, face grave dangers when social justice is the objective. Romans 13, 1-5 states, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong," y'all didn't know I was going to be preaching today, did you? Yeah, "be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain." And that's an important line. "For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. As for mercy, thank God he is merciful. We've all sinned and fall short of the glory of God and deserve death but for the mercy of the cross. But James 2:13 says that judgment is without mercy to one who has shown no mercy. Therefore, the application of mercy in our criminal justice system, at least after conviction, must be made by judges after considering the defendant's actions, whether he has shown mercy to his victims, as well as after listening to the victims. Today, I will expand on the topics of justice and mercy and consider where we should direct our efforts to seek justice and mercy in the criminal justice system. I will do so by considering 3 points. 1, capital punishment and abortion are not moral or constitutional equivalents, and to treat them as such is unjust. 2, mercy is impossible without considering the victim's pain, and when social justice is the goal, this cannot happen. Finally, 3, justice demands prosecution of all criminals, regardless of party or ideology. First of all, capital punishment and abortion are not moral or constitutional equivalents, and to treat them as such is unjust. Some say that you can't be pro-life and support the state's murder of criminals. I know a few conservative friends, Christian friends, in fact, who feel this way, and I understand this position. It seems to honor life in all forms. I have some more pragmatic friends, Larry Dom, who believe that the expense of the death penalty, which is much more than life sentences, is unjustified since it doesn't deter criminals from committing capital crimes. However, there are a few things wrong with these positions, especially in light of justice and mercy. The most obvious is in Romans 13:4. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. Now sure, there's some symbolism to the sword. However, it is still a sword. The government does not bear it in vain. When you break the law, you face, now, do y'all know what happens in the judge's courtroom when cell phones go off? We take the cell phone and we keep it until the end of the hearing. So I just wanted to throw that out there. When you break the law, you face the government's wrath. Some criminals deserve the full wrath of the sword. The sword must kill them for justice to be served. Indeed, even Jesus acknowledged that all who take the sword will perish by the sword. That's in Matthew 26:52. Moreover, God mandates capital punishment under certain circumstances. But if there is harm, then you shall pay life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, and stripe for stripe. This is in Exodus 21:23-25. The Old Testament does more than just mandate life for life. It lists a plethora of offenses where the death penalty is justified and thus righteous, including murder. Do we have any parents here? Any parents of kids that are still in school or teenagers? Cursing parents. Did you know that was in the Bible? Kidnapping a man and selling him into slavery. Hitting one's parents. sex with animals, adultery, premeditated murder, false prophecy. In these cases and others, the others mostly involving blasphemous acts, the Bible states unequivocally that there is a place for the ultimate punishment. Now, obviously, biblical mandates for the death penalty aren't applicable to secular government. Here, the determination must be whether the punishment fits the crime, whether it is just, and whether it protects the public by, one, removing the criminal from society and whether that's justified, and two, whether it deters future criminals from committing acts that are punishable by death. Now, a common refrain from opponents is that it doesn't deter. To be honest, I concur, at least with how the penalty is imposed today. In fact, studies show that the longer it takes for the state or federal government to impose the death sentence, the less it deters. Moreover, states without the death penalty overall have a lower violent crime rate than those with the penalty. Now, I don't put much stock in that latter data due to the fact that the average period on death row in all states is more than 20 years. Thus, any deterrent effect is washed away by unreasonable delays. You must go back in history almost a century for examples of a death penalty that actually deterred. Kansans will recall the Clutter murders, where two hardened criminals targeted a farming couple near Great Bend, Kansas, for home invasion and murder, November of 1959. Perry Smith and Richard Hickok broke into the Clutter's home, then murdered Mr. and Mrs. Clutter and their two children. They fled to Las Vegas, where they were captured in just 3 months. They were tried and convicted of capital murder 3 months after that. And they were hung to death just 5 years after that. Swift, efficient justice that included an appeal to the Kansas Supreme Court. Now, since Kansas reinstated the death penalty in 1994, few capital cases have been prosecuted and 0 criminals have paid the penalty, with multiple appeals to the state and federal level. There are just 9 criminals on death row in Kansas, but instead of giving you their names, I think it's best to consider the victims. Carrie Williams, Isabel Lewicka, and Suzette Troughton. Jason Befford, Brad Haka, Heather Mueller, and Aaron Sander. Mickey Martinez and Darren Warnke. Sheriff Matt Samuels, Jody Sanderholm, Karen Collar, Dorothy White, and Emily and Lauren Collar. Kaylee Bailey and her toddler, 11-month-old Lana Bailey, and Andrew Stout and Stephen White. These are victims who cannot ask for mercy because they are dead. Victims of the most heinous and brutal murders imaginable. The first criminal convicted of capital murder in Kansas after reinstatement was Gary Wayne Kleypas, who was convicted in 1998. He has been living on death row for more than 25 years. If delayed justice is justice denied, then justice is surely denied in Kansas. Now, it's important to understand the extremes our courts go through to ensure that capital defendants are afforded due process under the law. In Kansas, the average amount spent on a capital defendant's defense is more than $400,000, not including appeals, which is 5 times the cost of non-capital murder cases. Attorneys cannot represent a capital defendant unless he or she is death penalty certified, which requires substantial murder defense experience as well as second chairing more experienced attorneys in capital cases. You can't just walk into a lawyer's office and hire him to represent you in a capital case. The same goes for capital appeals. Experts are hired and paid for by the state. Pretrial motions are filed and argued. The courts spend a week or more just picking a jury and eliminating bias in favor of or opposed to the penalty, then several weeks of trial, and another week or more presenting mitigating evidence for the sentencing, which more often than not results in a life sentence and not the death penalty. Also, the death penalty is only an option if aggravating factors are present. Kansas death row inmates include killers who either raped, kidnapped, or tortured their victims, killed multiple victims, or killed a law enforcement officer. The Constitution guarantees them due process, and that's exactly what they receive. Now, to understand why capital punishment is just and abortion unjust, one must understand exactly what the Constitution guarantees. While the Declaration of Independence states that we are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, I think I did that better than Joe Biden. Did y'all notice that? The Constitution actually limits such rights. The only guaranteed right is that if the government attempts to take away your life, liberty, or property, you have due process rights to stand in its way pursuant to the 14th and 5th Amendments. Capital defendants exercise this right in the courts through the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 8th Amendments. As far as appeals, these are mostly argued via the 8th Amendment's ban of cruel and unusual punishments, which mostly fail. Herein lies the difference between capital punishment and abortion. While vile criminals who committed multiple homicides, raped or kidnapped their victims, committed other atrocious acts while murdering their victims, or murdered law enforcement officers assert due process in trial and the appellate courts, abortion victims have no such rights. Neither the children nor anyone else can oppose their murders. Hence, one can easily justify capital punishment by pointing out this hypocrisy as opposed to the so-called hypocrisy of pro-lifers supporting the death penalty. Give unborn children due process rights to resist their killings, and then argue that the death penalty is unjust. In fact, how can any justice system be just when the most heinous murderers, multiple victims, rapists, kidnappers, and torturers, or with other aggravating factors, are afforded due process and never face the penalty they were ordered to serve, while innocent unborn children are given no voice or due process at all? It cannot. Such a system is neither just nor merciful. Point 2, mercy is impossible without considering the victim's pain, and when social justice is the goal, this cannot happen. Proverbs 18:5 states that it is not good to be partial to the wicked or to deprive the righteous of justice. Judges and government must place more value on an orderly society than so-called social justice provides. We've seen a dramatic contrast, and I provided some examples in red states earlier, but we've seen a dramatic contrast between red state and blue state approaches to criminal justice, with the blue states seemingly caring more about social justice than actual justice. In blue states, citizens and victims are the ones paying the price of crime, with social justice prosecutors more concerned with the race and ethnicity of those they charge than in protecting the public. For proof, let's compare the George Floyd riots with January 6, 2021. In 2020, Seattle, Portland, Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., and other urban communities were literally set on fire. BLM and Antifa rioters looted and burned property regardless of the race of the property owners. Many Black, Asian, and Hispanic victims lost their homes and businesses to the rioters. Notable charred remains included a police station in Portland and the historic St. John's Episcopal Church in D.C. Yes, even D.C. was set on fire during those riots. Thus, the people were victims as well. Damage estimates were more than $1 billion. At least 25 people died. Yet only a few hundred out of thousands of rioters were prosecuted for their horrifically violent and deadly actions. January 6 is another story. Not one person not involved in the Capitol protest was killed. One so-called rioter was shot by a Capitol police officer. Not one firearm was seized from arrested protesters. On the high side, $2.7 million in damages were inflicted on various properties in D.C. Yet, 1,230 people were prosecuted for this singular event that ended in less than a day. Let's contrast these. Billions of dollars versus 2.7 million. A few hundred versus more than 1,000 people prosecuted. Dozens dead versus not one except for the actual alleged protester. Several cities on fire versus one with some broken windows and rather modest damage easily repaired or replaced. The primary differences in these two dark seasons in our nation's history are: one, major population centers versus the nation's capital, and two, minority rioters versus MAGA, primarily Caucasian protesters. Boiled down even further, Democrats versus Republicans, with the Democrats controlling the prosecuting authorities in every single victimized jurisdiction. Democrat, social justice-minded prosecutors chose to handle the perpetrators in blue states with kid gloves if they made an effort to prosecute at all. This naturally meant the victims of these heinous crimes were not heard. In D.C., a Democrat Justice Department went after conservative Republican protesters with a vengeance. It's also notable that then Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi, when asked to shore up the Capitol's defenses by bringing in National Guard troops to protect the Capitol, she refused and left property owners and the Capitol itself unprotected. I'm reminded of what happened here during the George Floyd riots. I'm a West Sider. Rumors went wild about a planned Antifa BLM riot at 21st and Mays. Sheriff Jeff Easter was on the ball. There were dozens, if not hundreds, of deputies at the intersection as well as every direction around it. It was an amazing sight. Also, we're blessed with the DA, Mark Bennett, who doesn't hesitate to prosecute all suspected criminals, regardless of race, sex, or ethnicity. Wichita city government's seeming hostility the last 4 years toward law enforcement resulted in vacant positions that made it difficult to properly police in Wichita, including having sufficient resources to protect us from the riots, as Sedgwick County Sheriff's Department did. Anybody remember the Quick Trip that was vandalized and broken into and destroyed? This also led to an increase in violent crime rates the past 2 years. We shouldn't hesitate to point out the positive difference pro-justice city, state, and federal leaders make in a community. We should also let people know which state, local, and federal leaders failed to protect them. Put another way, the people benefit when their leaders care more about victims than criminals. Here's what I mean when I say you can't have mercy without listening to and considering the victims, a natural consequence of so-called social justice. All or too much mercy is vaporous. There cannot be mercy when there is no or inappropriately light justice. First, you must arrest, prosecute, and convict criminals before mercy can be given. Only after these processes are complete can mercy enter the picture. When a criminal faces years in prison and the victims ask the judge to be lenient or forgives him in court, that's mercy. When the judge is free, then the judge is free to consider mitigation or mercy since he hears all voices. When the judge grants a departure to probation without hearing from the victims or considering the damage or heartache the criminal caused, that's just pitiful judging from someone who should be kicked off the bench. Recall James 2:13, for judgment without mercy to one who has shown no mercy. Again, for judgment is without mercy to one who has shown no mercy. In blue state jurisdictions, there's often no justice and therefore no mercy, mostly meted out by prosecutors who often don't prosecute suspects for drug or even violent crimes, especially when it's minority on minority crime. Consider Chicago's experience, which leaves the public unguarded and unprotected, especially those in our most vulnerable minority communities. No justice or mercy for the criminal and society. Without a criminal justice system focused on protecting the public as opposed to leveling the social playing field, there cannot be justice or mercy. There is only anarchy. Point 3. This is the part where I start to get in a little trouble. Justice demands prosecution of all criminals, regardless of party or ideology. You see where the trouble might be coming? Proverbs 20:23 states that unequal weights are an abomination to the Lord, and false scales are not good. When we do not learn from history, we are doomed to repeat it or make our own mess even worse. When analyzing what we're seeing with President Biden, Hunter Biden, and also Donald Trump, two events in our nation's history provide a powerful lesson and should instruct us on what to do next and possibly provide a message that voters will embrace. In 1921 to 23, Larry, do you remember that? Sorry. So he set me up. No, in 21 to 23, the Teapot Dome scandal, John Todd remembers that. Okay, all right, very good. Okay, you do then. The Teapot Dome scandal was the first truly black mark on the presidency of the United States. At the beginning of the Roaring '20s, the oil boom hit big time, with oil magnates supplanting steel and manufacturing magnates as the wealthiest, most influential Americans. They were so flush with cash and greedy for more that they didn't hesitate to bribe state and federal officials for more valuable treatment at oil and gas lease auctions. Under Republican President Warren G. Harding, the Department of the Interior awarded oil contracts without competitive bidding in the Teapot Dome oil reserves in Natrona County, Wyoming. An independent oil producer contacted his senator raising concerns of bribery at the highest levels of government. Wisconsin Republican, kind of see where I'm going, Republican Senator Robert M. La Follette led the initial investigation, which resulted in his offices being ransacked. The follow-up in-depth inquiry was led by Democrat Senator Thomas Walsh. Ultimately, the Senate committee discovered that hundreds of thousands of dollars in bribes were made to the Department of the Interior Secretary Albert B. Fall to secure the leases. He was the first presidential cabinet member in the history of the United States to serve prison time for criminal acts associated with his cabinet position. Republicans and Democrats joined in seeking the truth and ensured that the corruption was extricated from the executive branch, and those responsible went to prison. Watergate isn't ancient history, at least when compared to Teapot Dome. But there's a common element to each of these scandals that we're far from today. Republican President Richard Nixon's reelection team either went rogue to prepare Nixon for his debates or was authorized by Nixon when it burglarized the Democrat National Committee headquarters at the Watergate Plaza Hotel in D.C. on June 17, 1972. The purpose of the burglary was to gather intel for the upcoming debates by stealing data and planting listening devices. The burglars were caught. Although the catalyst of the scandal was the criminal burglary, the problem for Nixon was the cover-up. The Nixon tapes revealed that he was involved in the burglary, or at least at the authorization phase, and he engaged in obstruction of justice in his efforts to conceal the truth. But that's not the lesson to take away from this scandal. What's important is that, as with Teapot Dome, ideology didn't get in the way of justice. When it was clear that Nixon and his co-conspirators committed crimes, Republicans and Democrats went after him together. In fact, Nixon's own Attorney General, Elliot Richardson, appointed special counsel Archibald Cox to investigate. When Cox began uncovering evidence implicating Nixon, Nixon ordered Richardson to fire him. He refused. Instead, he resigned. Does anybody see Attorney General Merrick Garland resigning? Anybody? That's rhetorical. Prior to this, the United States Senate voted 77-0 to form a special committee to investigate the break-in and cover-up. Hence, Republicans refused to not do the right thing, and all Republicans in the Senate voted to investigate their own president, which I'm sure they knew would lead to problems in the next election for him and them, which it did when Republicans lost seats in the House and Senate and Democrat presidential candidate Jimmy Carter defeated incumbent Republican President Gerald Ford. I would also note that President Ford's pardon of Nixon and its impact on the 1976 election should be a lesson to President Biden as his first term comes to an end, and he might maybe consider pardoning Hunter Biden. Got a feeling. Notwithstanding Ford's pardon, Republicans and Democrats sought the truth and demanded justice once the truth was revealed. The president, vice president, senators, representatives, judges, and all executive appointees swear to uphold the Constitution. This should mean that they respect and enforce it. In addition to due process protections we've already discussed, equal protection under the law is an essential guarantee that these men and women swore to protect under the 5th and 14th Amendments to the United States Constitution. Indeed, in addition to the political leaders in D.C., every state official and elected official swears to uphold the Constitution, including equal protection under the law. What is equal protection? Simply stated, one class of person is not given special protection over another. Conversely, one class is not punished more than another. The law is applied equally to everyone, regardless of political party, race, sex, religion, or any other difference between us. Today, we have clear violations of equal protection under the law, both federally and in the states. Democrat Attorney General Merrick Garland prosecutes Republicans, but resists going after Democrats. Sure, he finally authorized prosecution of Hunter Biden, but only after a Trump-appointed judge blew up a sweetheart plea deal. In addition to not prosecuting classes they coddle, Democrat state attorney generals prosecute Republicans, but are hands-off of Democrats. To digress a little bit back to the abortion issue, Attorney General Garland prosecuted hundreds of pro-life protesters at abortion clinics where no one was harmed and no property damaged, but has yet to prosecute anyone for the dozens of pro-life pregnancy center vandalism incidents, including bombings, that occurred over the past 3 years. Seems like another example of violation of equal protection. I've heard some say that we should play by their rules. What's good for the goose is good for the gander. Does anybody feel that way? I don't see any hands. Raise your hand if you feel that way. Okay, we got a few that feel that way. But I think that position is preposterous. The fact is, we should be honorable by standing by our oaths. As in the days of Teapot Dome and Watergate, party affiliation or any other distinguishing factor must not enter into the equation of who we prosecute and hold accountable. If there's probable cause to believe someone broke the law, we should prosecute. If the defendants are Republicans, so be it. If Donald Trump broke the law, then Democrats and Republicans should go after him. If Democrats broke the law, then Democrats and Republicans should demand justice. We cannot have a two-tiered system. It seems to me that this is a message that we must communicate to voters. Let them know that our party, the Republican Party, will prosecute all criminals regardless of political affiliation, race, sex, class, sexual orientation, whatever. If they want criminals off the street and no longer victimizing people, vote Republican. To do otherwise is to sacrifice justice and mercy. And again, where do we end? Chaos. Anarchy. Exactly. I end as I began. Ephesians 5:11, take no part in the unfruitful works of darkness, but instead expose them. I end with that in part because, has anyone heard of the Eric Metaxas book, Letter to the American Church? If you haven't, and you haven't read it, you need to buy it, and you need to read it, you need to study it, because the bottom line is we need to start speaking out on issues like this, because we're losing our country quickly. That's all I have.
I'll have the questions now. Anybody have any questions for the judge? You answered all the questions.
Uh-oh, Carl's got a question.
Your Honor, I'm going to disagree with you on a point. In terms of two systems of justice, I mean, we have basically one system. We've got the guilty party, and we've got the party that this clueless party. I cite the immigration issue that had come up recently. The idea that there's two separate systems just goes to the fact that the Democrats could literally get away with murder and it wouldn't, if it's in the right jurisdiction. And I would cite for you that this proposed immigration bill that went down in flames had a provision in it that all the cases that might arise would be tried in the D.C. court, which is basically controlled at the district and appellate level by appointees of Biden and Obama. So if we're in an aconstitutional period, I'm not sure how we get back to where we need to be, but if you have any thoughts on how we could resurrect a constitution, it seems to be more like when the president takes an oath to faithfully execute all the laws of the United States, we have a wide open southern border, and he and his minions are not doing so. I think we have a big problem. Do you agree?
Yes. Well, and I would elaborate just a little bit. I know you start out by saying that I disagree with the one point. You're not. You're not disagreeing. You're saying the exact same thing I'm saying, except you're saying it's two tiers, Constitution, non-Constitution. So I don't necessarily think we disagree with that. As far as your other point, I hope that we can maintain the majority in the Supreme Court long enough for some things to happen that'll put us in a position where we can actually recover our constitutional form of government. And sadly, I think that's the solution. We've got to roll back some of these policies. For example, there's a challenge to the Chevron rule that's before the Supreme Court this upcoming term that involves commercial fishermen that are required to have an observer by I believe it's the FDA, it might be the EPA. It'd be the EPA. They're required to have an observer and these observers from their agency cost anywhere from $600 to $1,000 a day, and some of these smaller fishermen can't afford that. That's being challenged. That's a regulation. And the bottom line is the Supreme Court will have the chance to say regulatory authorities can't make laws, and this is a law. And once that Chevron rule goes down, that means every Supreme Court that has the opportunity to review those policies won't defer to the regulatory agency, and that's a very important case. I think that's going to dismantle a good part of the executive branch and what they've been trying to do with both from executive orders all the way down to administrative orders from the different executive agencies. So, but that's it. I mean, we need to roll some of this back, and we've got a few cases that are coming up that could do that. So,
sir, I got two questions, sir. One question is, in Alabama, one person was sentenced to death, and what they made him do was inhale nitrous oxide. It takes 3 to 4 minutes to go to death. Is it okay with you to make them inhale nitrous oxide so he would die after a few minutes?
well, I actually read about that, and our Commissioner Jim Howell, who happens to really like researching a lot of things. Anybody know Jim? Commissioner Howell, yeah. We discussed that in our Bible study actually on Wednesday a few weeks ago. That was before that person was put to death. And what's interesting about that procedure is it may take a minute or so, but based on the research that he did and the research that we reviewed with him, it's kind of like taking a sleeping pill. It just slowly takes the oxygen out of your blood, and you end up drifting off to sleep, and in this case, drifting off to death. And Dr. Reddy, I understand your concern because it is a fairly new process. But here's what we need to start doing when it comes to these types of cases, these death penalty cases. What that gentleman in Alabama went through is nothing compared to the victims that were raped, kidnapped, tortured, subject to all kinds of unspeakable acts before they were killed by their perpetrators. And again, I think justice in some cases calls for the ultimate penalty, and I think we're overemphasizing cruel and unusual punishment just a little bit. But
One more question. See, in California, there was a prisoner. He killed 12 people, so they put him in jail, jail for life. The thing was, he was not in good health. He was taken to the hospital. The doctor said he needs liver transplant. Prisoner needs liver transplant. You know, it's going to cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to do liver transplant, especially in California. Now, is it okay with you to spend the public money to save somebody who killed 3 people?
that's an easy one. No, in fact, I think California needs to bring back the death penalty. That would take care of that.
I'm sure you're not the man to help me, but I'm getting older and fading memory, and I would like advice on a crime I can commit and get away with that defense.
Run for president.
That was not me.
Yesterday, we saw a case where documents were not going to be charged, where another person is experiencing federal charges over the same offense, basically. And the pundit's been describing it as hypocrisy, and one described it as not hypocrisy, but tyranny. And what you described with the riots of 2020 as not as hypocrisy versus the January 6th riot, I don't describe it as hypocrisy, but being tyranny. You know, aren't we experiencing more tyranny in the two parties being treated differently than actually any hypocrisy?
Well, kind of like what Carl said, I think it's a semantic issue. I don't think we disagree. And again, short of talking about a particular candidate, I can talk about the difference between the parties, and I do think one party does honor and respect the Constitution more than the other, and I think we should take a stand in that regard.
When was the last time a death penalty was imposed in Kansas, and how does Kansas rank with other states on death penalties?
Well, there was a moratorium from the mid-'70s all the way up to 1994, and before that, I'm not sure when the last one was. It was probably sometime in the late 60s, early 70s. Carl might know. Yeah, that was 1960. So 1960, and there hasn't been one since. And we've had the death penalty in Kansas since 1994, and not one person. I think there have been a couple of cases on appeal that had been reduced to life sentences, and the other 9 are still waiting. And what I find interesting is one of the last, I think it was the last car case that got remanded. Does anybody know the reputation of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg? Does anybody know? Anybody know? Okay. She actually wrote in that opinion to kind of paraphrase her that the Kansas Supreme Court needs to read our decisions, which is kind of interesting. One of the most liberal justices said our Kansas Supreme Court wasn't paying attention to the Supreme Court precedent that they were quoting. So,
what's the best way to end the revolving door justice system? Should the legislatures decree mandatory sentencing, or should the judges pay more attention to keep them in jail?
well, that's an interesting question. First of all, and we have a few judges in here, I like the Kansas sentencing guidelines. And as a constitutionalist, I respect what the legislature does. And to kind of summarize what that is, we have a grid. We have a grid on one end on the top. You've got the criminal history of the person, which moves them further left when they have person felonies and more serious person misdemeanors. And actually on the top and on the right, on the left side of the grid, it's got the level of the crime. And bottom line is, you line those two up and you got a box, and you have three options. There's the low number, the mid number, and the high number. And the judge technically is required to impose one of those. And if it falls in the grid that's mandatory prison, that's where the judge needs to send them. If it falls into presumptive probation, then they get probation. Now, we'll tell you there's some cases, almost every case, any good defense attorney will file a motion for departure and ask judges to depart dispositionally and place them on probation when the presumption is prison. For me, that's very rare. That's very rare because, again, if a judge defers to the legislature, which they should, they will impose the guideline sentence, the mandatory sentence. And I think you have to have real extreme cases. And I've kind of covered that a little bit here. If I have multiple victims or victims come in and say, we understand, we forgive them, we ask the court to be lenient, that's a situation. Or when the defendant is actually not just pleading to get out of jail, but pleading because he's remorseful about what happened. Those are situations that sometimes might justify departure. But in general, I think you're right on. I think judges should be locked in to mandatory sentences.
All right, and one last question, Dr. Beck.
Hey Kevin, how you doing?
Good, how are you?
Love you.
Love you too, brother.
Well, I do.
That's not a question.
You're the greatest. So anyway, everybody in this room, and probably half the nation, know that we live under a dictatorship. It is a two-tier justice system. All the things, you can list probably 10 things that are facts. The media is probably the biggest at fault. But if that's the case, why don't we just call it out and just list 10 things that are factual, that we have lost our freedom of speech. We do live in a two-tier justice system. How do we go about just stop sugarcoating or beating around the bush and just call it for what it is? We do not live in a republic anymore, and we don't have freedom of speech, and it is a two-tier justice. And I think that would help people out, that if that was just like the tablet, the Ten Commandments. This is what this country is now, and we just need to call it out.
Well, I go back to what I said earlier in a book that Carl and our Bible study group is studying. That's that book, Letter to the American Church, because what Eric Metaxas does is he contrasts where we are now with where Germany was right before the Nazis took over. And you know what? There are a lot of things that we're going through now that put us in a closer position to that type of tyranny than Germany was. So we have to speak out. Whenever we see these issues, I agree with you, Hutch. We've got to tell the people. We've got to tell people what's going on. We've got to inform them. Because if you're not at a Pachyderm Club, you're probably not hearing these things.
I think Vic. Last question?
We're going to sneak in one more.
I just have a simple question. Is Hillary Clinton off the hook? She's never going to be, can't ever be charged and go to prison?
Okay, well, I guess from a legal perspective, I think in federal cases, maybe Phil or Linda might know this, I think there's a 5-year statute of limitations for most federal charges. She's old. I mean, she is really old now, right? I mean, how long has it been since she was anywhere near, the White House? So I think she's aged out. And even in some of Hunter Biden's cases, some of those tax cases, he's also beyond the statute of limitations for a lot of those prosecutions. So you've got a statute of limitations, which is important. If you're not familiar with it, bottom line is like in Kansas, for example, for all but murder cases, there's a 5-year statute of limitations. So the prosecution has to file charges within 5 years of the incident. And it's a little longer for minors. For minors, it doesn't start until they turn 18. So bottom line is that defendants are entitled to full due process, and that includes having fresh witnesses, fresh evidence. So we need a statute of limitations, but I think with hers, we're so far past that, I don't think there's any chance of anything happening there.
Judge Kevin Smith. Would you like to comment?